Welcome to everybody. It's so great to see everyone. I really was surprised when Otis suggested this, and there was a couple of people that suggested. I was very shocked that anybody would be interested in such dodgy stuff as philosophy. I mean, uh, but here we are. So a bunch of nerds getting together and being nerdy. Who could ask for more? Uh, so that just to repeat myself for those who just joined, we're going to record everything, and there's no formality here. Just join or leave as you please. Interrupt me anytime you feel like it, or if you want to put something on chat, you can do that. And like I said, I'm going to email everyone within a day. I'll email everyone, and actually, Zoom has this AI function, which is basically note taking by somebody who of I'd say mediocre intelligence. It's like somebody who's not dumb but is not paying perfect attention, and that person is taking notes, and that's what the AI comes out as. And maybe I'll send that along. It's a little bit risky because I've been monitoring it, and it's not 100%. In other words, there are things that are, and that's understandable. I'm sure if my students, a long time ago, I had a midterm that was so bad that I thought I'd gone insane. I thought I must be just babbling in front of the class and saying nothing of any that made any sense. And so I didn't force her, but I asked my wife to attend a class and take notes. And miraculously, everything that was in her notes was exactly what I said. So anyway, what I'm saying is a student would probably not do as good as the AI is doing. So anyway, that is something that gets preserved out of each meeting as well as the recording. So I'll probably send that out to you. And if you don't get an email, that's the important thing here is if you don't get an email, then contact me to make sure I've got you on the email list. All right, so I'm going to just plunge forward unless there's any questions about what I just said. All right, so what I'm going to do, what I plan to do is just a traditional course in philosophy. It's all the basic guys, the canon, as they call it. And I don't do this just because I'm a stodgy old fart who likes old dead white guys from Europe. I do it because these guys are the foundations of intellectual life in the Western world. It's going to be limited to Western philosophy, not that I don't have great respect for example, Advaita Vedanta or Hindu traditions, which I do, but we have to limit it someplace. And so I think we could get a fairly good conversation going just on Western philosophy. We will start at the very beginning before the pre-Socratics. I'm just going to talk a little bit about mythology and the things I think that led up to philosophy. And then we'll proceed just historically all the way to about the 19th century. And then if you guys have any questions about the 20th century, we could talk about that too. The reason I don't usually talk about the 20th century in this class is because I think to understand what the logical positivists and Wittgenstein were up to, you have to understand the problems that they were addressing. Because when I took Wittgenstein at Pomona, my reaction and the reaction of other people in the class was, this is not philosophy. What is this? It's just a bunch of junk about technical stuff about words. Well, it turns out we do philosophy in words. And so I would compare it to, yes, you want to play a song, but actually first you better pay attention to whether your guitar is in tune or not. And so it would be the equivalent in philosophy of spending the whole hour just tuning your guitar. And that's why it seemed to us, the guys that took that first Wittgenstein class, it seemed to us that this wasn't addressing anything important that we were interested in, but it turns out it is important. But we'll see. If you guys are interested in that, we can certainly talk about it. The other thing I want to say is that I am going to kludge together both my ethics and intro to philosophy class. The same, more or less the same group of people are involved, although some people are more important for, say, ethics than others, and some people are more important for metaphysics. So the two classes I teach, well, I teach more than that, but the two classes I teach are ethics and then just intro to philosophy, but that's concentrated on what I would call metaphysics, and metaphysics can be divided into, well, first of all, the word metaphysics. This is kind of funny. Well, the word philosophy, what's that? It's philo is love and Sophia is wisdom. So love of wisdom. That's the etymology. As far as metaphysics goes, it's kind of funny because if you went to a bookstore and you were looking for the metaphysics section, they would probably lead you to books on the occult. That's not really what we're talking about. The word metaphysics actually comes from Aristotle's works. And Aristotle, we don't have any of the works that he intended for publication. They've been lost. And so what we have is a bunch of essentially lecture notes that were put together by his students and edited by them. And when they assembled them, they had a chapter called the Physics, which is Aristotle's idea on physics. And then the next one they were working on was something after the physics. And in Greek, meta means after. We tend to think of it as like Jeff Bezos, like above this meta thing. But actually, the word can just mean physically after, the next thing, or temporally after. So metaphysics is just that. And I would divide it into two subcategories, which is ontology and epistemology. By the way, I'm not going to just shower you with a bunch of technical terms, which I don't think are, I think often they're more confusing than they are useful, but I'm obliged to use a couple of them. So metaphysics, I'm going to divide into ontology and epistemology. Ontology is just the study of what is real. Like, is God real? Are your ideas real? Are unicorns real? Are numbers real? Those are ontological questions having to do with what is real. Epistemology is the study of evidence, or how you support what you think is real. How can you prove it? So those are two of the main categories in the study of philosophy: epistemology and ontology. So we'll be talking about those guys, and we're going to be talking about ethics, and I'll make some distinctions in ethics, but we'll get to that later. So Aristotle, the definitions of philosophy, I just gave you the idea of philo and Sophia being love of wisdom, but one can get lost trying to define what philosophy is up to. But I'm just going to go with Aristotle had the idea that human beings were curious. They had a desire to understand the world. And I think he's right to distinguish this from intelligence, pure and simple. Like animals, we know that some animals are intelligent, but it's less okay now to say that human beings are the only things that are intelligent. And this is because of a failure of imagination, I think, earlier. People couldn't imagine what kind of intelligence an octopus could have, because an octopus has 9 brains. And so calling it intelligent, we don't have any possible metric for determining how intelligent it is. And I imagine the reverse is true too, that an octopus would probably say, okay, let's see how how many times you could change the texture and color of your skin in the next 15 seconds. And if you can't do that, you're kind of dumb, you know? So I would compare our judgment of other animals' intelligence to an octopus trying to imagine how we could possibly, you know, in other words, it doesn't compute. However, the idea of curiosity, I think it's fair enough to say that most animals are curious, even microbes are curious. They probe their environment. But most animals are, as far as I know, curious only about those things that are impactful and, you know, have something to do with finding food, finding shelter, avoiding predation, finding a mate, things that have practical and immediate effects on their well-being. And human beings, on the other hand, are insanely curious about, like, you really do not know, need to know the formula for the ellipse of the Earth's orbit around the sun to get through the day. You just do not need to know this. And there's an infinite number of things. There's just no limit to the things we're curious about. We really want to know things, and we're uncomfortable if we don't know things. So I think I'm just going to use that as kind of a basic philosophical stance, that we're just curious about stuff and we want to understand stuff, and that leads us to a lot of paths that are sometimes frustrating or dead ends, and there's metaphors for that too. But anyway, what we, as far as we know, when language evolved, and that probably predates Homo sapiens. So let's say it could be as much as 500,000 years ago. But Neanderthals, we have some kind of idea, may have had the ability to communicate with language. There's, you know, reasonable evidence for that. We can't say for sure, of course, because we don't have any record of it, but they seem to have had that ability, and certainly Homo sapiens did. And what happened was, when they became curious about things, they would explain things to one another. And so mythology is born out of a desire to understand. Sometimes mythology is about a famous battle or a famous champion or something like this. It can be like that. But also there are myths that aim to explain the way things are. And the way things are, it can be either our behavior. Why do we go to church on Sunday? Well, that's because God created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh. And so that's what we'll do in our respect or devotion to God. We're going to mirror his behavior, right? So etiological is the word for myths that explain things, not ideological, but etiological. So etiological myths are explanatory. They describe or explain why certain things are the way they are. And these could be human behavior. They can also be how the earth came to be, like Maui lowered his magic anchor to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, and he grabbed the bottom like it was a carpet, and he hauled it up above the surface of the water, and that's how the islands of the South Pacific were created. So that's an explanation. And, or, you know, where does lightning come from? Zeus flashed his lightning bolt on us. That's how that happened. And so these explanations worked fine for a couple 100,000 years. Meanwhile, the human being had established themselves as solid members of the animal kingdom. We didn't need anything else to be perfectly good citizens of the earth. That lasted literally a couple of 100,000 years. We didn't need any science. We didn't need any philosophy. We just told each other stories, and that was just fine. The inadequacy of myths, it stems from our inability to determine which one is the right myth, which one is correct. And this was resolved in a couple of different ways. One famous way in the Old Testament is Elijah has a contest between himself and the priests of Baal. And the idea is that we're going to sacrifice a bull and we're going to see whose God can start the fire. Whose God can do a magic trick and start the fire that will roast the bull for sacrifice. And so the priests of Baal try it. They try all kinds of rituals and prayers, and they don't succeed. And then Elijah, he says something, and boom, the bull starts on fire. I doubt if the story would be in the Bible if that wasn't the outcome. But anyway, something, if I don't know, I went to Sunday school and was raised a good Christian boy. And something I don't remember from Sunday school is what happened next, which is Elijah had all of the priests of Baal executed. Ooh. And there was like there was a couple of hundred of them, and he just had them killed. That'll take care of it, I guess.
400.
400?
Yeah, but it also says that Jezebel had killed all the prophets of the Lord, so that Elijah was the last one left.
Yes.
So that partly explains why the massacre
took
place.
Yes, as insofar as such things can be explained.
Yeah.
Thanks for that. The other way that we've traditionally determined whose myth is right is war. And so we just kill the other people if we don't like the way they think. And this is, of course, still prominent today. We still do this. And I guess that works too, because Hobbes is going to say that the difference between mythology and religion is that mythology doesn't have an army. And so we know that there are no warriors defending Zeus's honor. So we consider that a myth. But there are warriors that will defend Allah. And so that's a religion. This is Hobbes' distinction that he makes. Anyway, I think you'll agree that the process that Elijah uses and war, neither of these are very satisfactory for any number of reasons. In other words, you could kill everybody else, but you still haven't established that what they were saying was false. So what I want to do is, well, our association with the Greeks, the Greek myths that are kind of exist the pre-Socratic. So the pre-Socratics were born into a world where there were myths, and these are going to provide kind of a foundation, and I want to argue why that might be the case in Greece that gave birth to the pre-Socratics and the philosophical tradition. It seems perhaps prejudicial or not fair or not liberal or not egalitarian to say that what happened in Greece did not happen elsewhere. But I think a case can be made for this. The beginning of philosophy in Greece was something very significant and very weird. And like I say, we'd existed for a couple 100,000 years without any need for this kind of stuff. In India and China and Babylon and Egypt, it's not like they gave no thought to these things. But the pre-Socratics had a different approach, and it's very significant, and it's going to give birth to the entire rest of the history of the intellectual development of the human race. And I think Philby, if he were here, is Philby here? I don't think he is, but if Philby were here, he would say that we should have stopped before the Greeks. and just called it a day. We were doing fine. We didn't need all this stuff. We hadn't injured the earth hardly at all. It was negligible. But once the cat was out of the bag or the horse was out of the corral with the Greeks, all of a sudden, now I wouldn't say all of a sudden, but in the next, all of a sudden, relative to the 200,000 years that have gone before, in 2,000 years, we have completely changed world civilization and the planet. And that started with the pre-Socratics. And so it's reasonable to ask, why did this happen in Greece and not so much in India or some other place? Our source for Greek myths, and like I say, the pre-Socratics are the ones that inherited this. This was the intellectual background that they all inherited. And I think it's reasonable to ask, what about that background or that foundation made it a fertile place for philosophy to develop? Now, our first sources for Greek mythology are Hesiod and Homer in about the 8th century BC. Hesiod wrote the Theogony and the Works and Days, and Homer wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey. And there's an interesting story about why this happened in the 8th century BC. I'm probably telling you stuff you already know, but in the late Bronze Age, in the 13th century, there was something called the Bronze Age collapse. And this impacted most all of the big civilizations in the Eastern Mediterranean. It seems to not have affected the Phoenicians so much, but it struck the Hittites and certainly the Minoans and the Mycenaeans, which are the Greeks, and to a degree, it struck Egypt. And we don't know what caused it. The theories are mainly revolve around some kind of environmental catastrophe, like a drought that lasted 100 or 200 years. But it's very hard to tell because the Phoenicians didn't seem to suffer that much, but the Greeks suffered terribly. And what happened was, by the way, this date coincides with the Trojan War. So there's no proof of this at all, but it's reasonable to assume that the destruction of Troy was part of this, but we don't know that. Anyway, what happened in Mycenae, which was a big center of Greek culture at the time, was that they used to use a language called Linear B, and that was their written language. And after the Trojan War, after that time, the Bronze Age collapse, this fell out of use. And the great cities of Greece fell into ruins. And that would include certainly Mycenae and Pylos, and I'll get back to that. Anyway, what happened was the language fell out of circulation. So for 400 years, this is kind of unimaginable to us who have instant communication 24 hours a day. For 400 years, there was no written language in Greek. This is called the Greek Dark Ages. And it's just unbelievable. But the cities just fell apart and there was no written language. And then around, say, the 8th century BC, the Greeks adopted the Phoenician alphabet. And the Phoenician alphabet, with some modifications, became the ancient Greek alphabet that you and I are familiar with today. And that's the alphabet that Homer and Hesiod used. They were the first major writers to use those figures, those symbols to represent an alphabet. So Homer and Hesiod, what we think they did was report on the mythology that existed. We don't think they made this stuff up. They could have, but it's more likely that what they did was write down the mythologies that they had inherited. And in the case of Homer, this included the Trojan War. It was mainly centered around the Trojan War. Now, in the ancient world, believe it or not, it was assumed that Homer had just made all this up, that this was just a story. Eratosthenes, who's the guy who discovered the world was round and figured out how big it was, thought that it was just a bunch of nonsense. It was just a bunch of fairy tales. And this was the majority belief until the late 19th century, when a guy named Schliemann discovered the ruins of Troy. And Schliemann was an amateur archaeologist. He didn't do that great of a job, but anyway, he did discover what we still think is Troy. And by the way, that dig is still going on to this day. They're still digging up Troy and analyzing which layer. Now, what they discovered was Troy had probably been inhabited for a couple of thousand years before the Trojan War. And so there are lots of layers, and they have to try to sort out which one is the layer that maybe Achilles saw, right? So they're still figuring that out today. But in any case, we now believe Homer wasn't making this up. And we know that we know that human beings can memorize things that long as the Iliad, because people today have memorized the Quran. So what we think is it was the story of the Iliad and the Odyssey were passed down for 400 years orally. There were these guys called rhapsodes that you could hire to come to your dinner party, and they would come and sing the Odyssey or the Iliad. And I have a little theory about this that, it doesn't matter. Anyway, what we think is that Homer could have been one of those people, but in any case, he inherited the language and learned how to write it down, and he wrote down these myths. Now, there's a couple of things about Greek myths that I think are very interesting and pertinent for, like what I said, that the groundwork for the birth of philosophy. By the way, a really interesting book on the Odyssey is there's a guy named Tim Severin who made a replica of Odysseus's ship using Bronze Age plans and methodologies. And then he sailed it. He tried to recreate Odysseus's voyage home from Troy to Ithaca. And that is, you can buy a book called The Ulysses Voyage, which is worth reading. It's what a cockamamie idea to just try to recreate the whole thing. But he did it, and it's a very interesting book. And he's a Cambridge guy. He's not an idiot. So very, very interesting. So there are several themes, I think, that we see within the mythology of the Greeks that was inherited by Hesiod and Homer that may have laid the groundwork for philosophy. Now, this is just speculation. There's no way to verify this in any reasonable way. And matter of fact, I'm not sure I've heard this theory before, but I think it's worth reviewing. First of all, the Greeks were polytheists, and that's evident from the Theogony and the Iliad and the Odyssey. They were polytheists. And another thing about the polytheism is the Olympian gods. There is a Mount Olympus in northern Greece, and the Olympian gods, the big 12, usually depends on what list you look at, but there are 12 of them. And I think of great interest is the fact that half of them were female. And these were not handmaidens or just the wife of so-and-so. These were gods, forceful, powerful, terrifying gods in their own right, and not to be trifled with. For example, the Trojan War was, there's a story called The Judgment of Paris that supposedly started the Trojan War, which probably is not the real reason. But anyway, in the Trojan War, Aphrodite backed the Trojans and Athena backed the Greeks. And if you read the Odyssey, you'll realize that at every stage of the way, Athena is protecting Odysseus. And you can see a lot of scenes in that book go south if she hadn't stepped in and saved him. So you've got this, if you can imagine the Lone Ranger or something, one of our heroes, right? But he's got an angel, and every time he's in danger, the angel steps in and stops the bullet from hitting him. That's the equivalent of what Athena does for Odysseus. This is not an independent macho guy who's just got it all, the world by the balls. He's got this woman who's taking care of him, making sure he doesn't get hurt. He wouldn't have got home otherwise. So I don't think that's insignificant, that half of the gods of ancient Greek, half of the powerful gods were female. And obviously Athens, if you went to Athens, you would have seen a huge statue of Athena in the Parthenon. And as a matter of fact, I don't know if you guys know this, but they made a replica of the Parthenon in Athens many decades ago. And you could go to Athens and see a full-size statue of Athena and a replica of the Parthenon, of all places, Nashville. So anyway, but what I want to say about the polytheism is that the Greeks, unlike what we were just talking about having wars about whose God was right, the Greeks didn't fight about religion. They had a big statue of Athena in the Parthenon, and in Olympia they had a big statue of Zeus in their big temple. But they didn't say, "You dang Olympians, you worship Zeus, we're going to come kill you." The Greeks were very belligerent people. They were always fighting. But I don't know of any instance where they fought about religion. They just didn't fight about it. They accepted that all these gods were powerful. None of the gods were omnipotent. None of the gods were omniscient. They would answer to different parts of the human psyche. Like if you were lovelorn, you go to Aphrodite, and probably even if you were horny, you could go to Aphrodite. Probably something you wouldn't want to do to your priest. You wouldn't want to go to the priest and say, I'm not getting enough these days. I don't think you'd do that, but that's what you would do to Aphrodite for sure. Or Ares. Ares was another one of the Olympian gods, and you could offer a sacrifice to Ares because you hate somebody and you want to see their legs get broken. That's another thing that I don't think you'd take to your normal Protestant minister and ask him for some help in hurting somebody. But that was normal stuff in Greece. And so they had all these different gods. And I don't want to make too much of it, but they lived in a society that I'm tempted to call liberal, because they were accepting of radically different beliefs about the powers that be in the universe. And it didn't bother them. It didn't get them all twisted and angry and mad at one another because of that. They might be mad about something else, but they weren't mad about the gods. They were the supernatural. They weren't mad about that. As far as I could tell. Now, I'm not an expert on all this stuff. Okay, another thing about the myths that I want to point out that we see from Hesiod and Homer are the emphasis on the here and now. Unlike the Christians, and Christians don't exist yet, but the Egyptians, for example, there wasn't a heavy emphasis on the afterlife. The Greeks had the three brothers, Hades and Poseidon and Zeus, had their three regions. Zeus was the sky, Poseidon was the sea and the land, and Hades was the underworld. And they recognize the existence of the afterlife in things like the Elysian Fields and Tartarus, which were areas that the dead go to. Elysian Fields if you're good, and Tartarus if you're bad, but it's not like at all like heaven and hell. It's not like that. But anyway, the emphasis of Aristotle and Plato and of Odysseus, as I'll say in a minute, was on this life, not the afterlife. in Christianity, we're going to see a big change from this, but we'll get to that later. And a couple of examples that to tell you about the afterlife in, for instance, the Odyssey, is that on his way back to see, to get home to Ithaca and Penelope, he is waylaid on the island of Calypso, Calypso's island, and she just keeps him there for like 7 years as her little boy toy. And she offers him eternal life and the companionship of a goddess forever. He's never going to get old. But the whole time, Odysseus wants to get home. And he wants to get home because that's where he's supposed to be. He's supposed to be a human. And this has something to do with the idea of Moira. Maybe you know somebody named Moira. Moira means fate, and the Moirae were the three fate sisters. But the idea of Moira isn't limited to just what's going to happen in the future. It's the right place for things. Another couple of words that have to do with this in Greek culture are ananke and logos. And these all imply that there's an order to the universe that's even above the gods. There's a right order to things. And the Moira of the gods is to be eternal, but the Moira of man is not to be eternal. It's to be mortal and to die as immortal and live as immortal. And so what Calypso is offering Odysseus violates that order. And Odysseus, one of the heroic things about him is he's not buying it. He wants to do the right and natural thing. And she finally, in fact, the gods send Hermes down and say, look, let my boy Odysseus go. And so the gods on Olympus send Hermes down to tell her, nah, you got to let this guy go. And so she does, and he gets home. Another incident that happens in the Odyssey is that when he's on Circe's island, Circe tells him a way, a ritual, and a place to go to communicate with the dead. And he gets to visit with the ghosts of Achilles and Agamemnon. And Achilles tells him that he'd rather be Achilles, who spent his whole life trying to be the most famous warrior on the planet. That was his whole, he wanted to be immortalized, which apparently he succeeded in doing, because here we are talking about him. Anyway, he tells Odysseus that he'd rather be a slave on the poorest farm in Attica than be the ruler of all the dead. So this is not the Christian idea of the heaven that we hope for in the afterlife. He's saying, nah. I don't want, this sucks. Being dead sucks. So those are just two little indications that there wasn't a big emphasis on the afterlife. And this means that Plato and Aristotle and the rest of the, also the pre-Socratics, want to figure out what this life is like, what life is on earth, what life is. And as a matter of fact, Plato sort of believed in the immortality of the soul, but it was not like Christians. It was reincarnation. We'll get to that. Aristotle did not believe the soul was eternal at all. So there you go. It's not it's more related to what we can see and observe and rationally understand. Aristotle is. Okay, one other theme that I want to mention is there was no priestly class in Greece and no set of doctrines, no scripture. There wasn't a Bible. There wasn't the priests in the temples were functionaries. They would run the rituals and they would take care of the temple and make sure it was taken care of. But they weren't like the Pope sending out missives about what was right and what was wrong. That is not, there was no such class of people in ancient Greece. So there wasn't this monoculture or monolithic message of what the truth is. It's another aspect of polytheism, I think. And the last thing I'm going to say about this is about the culture that the pre-Socratics inherited. is that there was an acceptance of criticism. I'm not sure. We're going to get to this more when we discuss Christianity. I'm not sure how this can be overstated. When we get to Thales, Thales had two students, Anaximander and Anaximenes. And Thales was going to be kind of a physicist. He was trying to figure out what the ultimate stuff was. And we can make fun of him, but he was one of the most important intellectuals in Western history because he believed everything was made out of water. And I'll explain maybe next time why this isn't as stupid as it sounds for a guy living without in the pre-scientific age. But in any case, his students, now bear in mind that before this, in the world where there's priests and voodoo doctors and there are seers and people with prophets in the Old Testament. In a world like that, what their followers did was give them reverence and respect. And you'd say, the master says this. The master says this is how Buddha was treated and how Jesus was treated. But the students of Thales say, nah, I don't think so. You made a mistake there. So the very first example we have of philosophy is somebody not buying what their predecessor says, what their mentor or master says. And I think it's best said by Aristotle, who was a student of Plato for 20 years, but didn't agree with him. And his quote was, "Dear is Plato, but dearer still is the truth." And this kind of lack of devotion to the teaching of your master is what we see throughout the history of philosophy. But it is a complete change from everything I see that went before. All right, so that's just a little intro thing for today, and enough said by me. I will recommend a couple of books if these things are of any interest to you and you want to follow up, and there's no reason to do that or no requirement to do that. But for Greek mythology, it's Edith Hamilton and Robert Graves, and then those two books are the kind of classics. And then for the pre-Socratics, okay. For the pre-Socratics, you want a book by Kirk and Raven called The Pre-Socratic Philosophers. If you want to follow up on this, there's not any. Well, were you holding that up, Doug? What do you have there? Yeah, that's it. Pre-Socratic Philosophers by Kirk and Raven. And since it looks like you may have looked into that, you can correct all my mistakes next time when I talk about these. But that's what we'll do next time is we'll start with Thales and talk about the pre-Socratics and why even though they seem silly, they're very important and a very big turning point in the development of the human mind. So there you have it. That's my talk for today. Anybody got questions, criticisms? I'd love to hear them.
Can you take it off mute?
It is. You can talk.
Okay. There's a book I'd like to recommend. It's an old Pelican paperback, Before Philosophy, The Intellectual Adventure of Ancient Man. It's by 4 different authors. Most of it is about Egypt and one chapter on Egypt, a long chapter, and one on Mesopotamia. But there is an epilogue about how the Israelite conception of God was different and how the Greek conception of philosophy was different, in ways that fit very well with what you've been saying, that the question of curiosity and trying to figure out what the intelligible order of the universe is. I think it's a brilliant book. It's especially good on Heraclitus. So
what's the name again?
Before Philosophy.
Before Philosophy.
are two man and a wife, both named Frankfurt, and John A. Wilson, the Egyptologist, and Torkil Jakobson, the student of Mesopotamia.
Great, thanks. Before philosophy.
Yeah.
Tony, would you send out a new message to the group about the link to the course and also the passcode? I know Ingrid Carlstern has been trying to get in while we've been meeting today and
Oh
can't
no.
make that work.
Ingrid, I'll make a note to say because it did go out to the Pomona list and I did it yesterday and she's on that list, so I'm kind of surprised. But
I think what it is if you already have Zoom, it's a different route to if you click on the link and you don't realize what about a passcode, I don't, and it can be confusing. So that might have held her up.
Yeah, I would agree with that. That I had a hard time. Fortunately, I started a half an hour early, but getting Zoom to actually function, which I hadn't done for years, was just an odyssey, shall we say.
Well, I can relate, setting up this session today, it seems like it worked as far as I can tell, but if you are actually setting up the Zoom meeting, there must be 60 or 80 different little switches that
Wow.
and you're terrified that one of those switches is going to screw up the whole thing and you just don't know which one because you don't understand what they all do and whether there's a tree or a hierarchy that one switch is going to blow the whole thing up. But it looks like it worked, but I had to do so anyway. What I'm saying is I can relate. I'll send it out again. Maybe I'll send was there anybody else besides Ingrid that that didn't get in that you know of?
She's been emailing while we've been talking, and some of us in the course have been responding to her on the side.
Oh, that's
but
too
she's
bad.
the only one that I've seen.
Okay, I'll try to make it possible for her to get in next time. That's great. Any other questions, objections, comments, insults?
I have really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Oh, good. Happa, you got something to say?
Yeah, so I won't be able to come on Tuesdays, but is it the same link to YouTube or you have a link for each class? To listen to it later.
However the session turns. What's that?
However the gods deem it.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, if I can imagine that one or more of these things may give birth to a wide-ranging discussion. We might get hung up listening to ourselves for a while. Otherwise, so it'll just be as long as it is. Whatever this is, it's just going to be.
So there'll be an individual link to YouTube for each class meeting.
No. Yeah. Each one will be separately posted. Right.
Right. Thank you.
Yep.
Okay.
Anything else?
Yeah, I think this is going to be fun.
Well, I'm really glad to hear it. I mean, obviously, it's just not my normal way of teaching. Normally, when I teach a class, there's a huge amount of interaction that I try to stimulate. And that's a little bit more cumbersome here with Zoom. And you don't have the actual bodies and the energy in the room. But it looks like it's going to, I think it'll work out okay. We'll sort it out as things go along. But I just couldn't be more pleased to see all you guys interested. As I was telling Otis at the beginning, before some of you got here, I've studied this since I could remember the day I started studying philosophy. And I was sitting in my parents' backyard and I was a music major assigned to read John Stuart Mill. And he's not the most inspiring he's important, but he's not the most inspiring or emotional philosopher. And for some reason, I had this epiphany that I was going to die. And it wasn't a bad thing. It was like, oh my God, my hours on this planet are limited. I better get on with it. And so that was when I decided to transfer to Pomona and major in philosophy. And then I've been interacting with these guys ever since, now to my 78th year. And one of the things about philosophy is you can do it while you're riding your bike. Like when you see those, you see those cop shows or detective shows where somebody's having a conversation, the detective is having a conversation, and all of a sudden he goes, "Oh," in other words, some part of the mystery reveals itself to him because somebody said something about chicken, you know. And that's how philosophy is. You could just all of a sudden something pops into your head and you go, "Oh, that argument's not going to work." Anyway, I've been doing that for my whole life, and I don't have anybody except my students to talk to about it with. So it's such a pleasure to see everybody here, and I hope it's not a disappointment. If it is, it's not the philosopher's fault.
This is
are
exactly
very
what I was
interesting.
hoping for. I'll just say that.
What's
That's
that? I'm
funny.
sorry.
What I was
I
hoping
just
for.
want to thank you. This was terrific. I am supposed to be in a meeting on Tuesday at this time on writing papers in the Alzheimer's world. But the last meeting we had on that, we spent the whole time whining about the fact that we were going to have to change, since you spoke about words, we have to revise all the words we use, because we can't say female, we can't say disparities, we can't say this, that, or the other. And, so I don't know what we're going to write if we can't talk about anything concrete, about anything that's different in the Alzheimer's. I mean, so I think philosophy may be a better way to spend my time
Oh,
than on a study of why dementia is not just in old white men and
Oh my God.
and you're not demented. I'm happy to see.
Well, we haven't established that yet.
Yeah, right.
He's good.
Well, we'll just call you, Laurel, and have a chat to make sure we're not demented at any point when we begin to think we are.
Okay. Yeah, it's lovely to have Laurel, an authority on that matter here.
It is.
It's
really
very
is.
timely.
Recognition, but I've been around it long enough that the really obvious stuff, you don't need a clinician to say, there is something.
That's true.
All right, guys. Well, if there's nothing else, I will see you on Tuesday at 10 a.m. And again, if you came in late, what I want to do is I'm going to be within the next 24 hours, I will send an email. And what that email will include, hopefully, is a URL for the recording and also the artificial intelligent note taker. I'll try to get the text of that. And if you don't get it, please email me because I want to make sure I don't lose anybody. That's the important thing. All right.
All right.
Thank you.
Anyway, yeah, this is terrific. Thank you.
All
Thanks,
right,
Tony.
guys. We'll see
right.
you next time.
All
Thanks,
right.
Tony.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Tony.
Yeah,
All right.